Hey folks, welcome to the pre-show. In just a minute late this evening for the pre-show, but we are also not broadcasting again on the radio station. We still do not have the technical difficulties worked out. And then I sat down here a minute ago and my kids messed with my stuff and my mic was all unscrewed and everything. I don't know what they're doing messing with that for, but there it is. All right. So welcome to the program. We're going to start still at 9:03 as we normally do. And we'll get rolling here in just a minute. This is 9:02:45 right now. So we'll go get going at 9:03. We're going to go dark and we'll be right back.
Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. This is your host, Scotty Roberts, and you're right here on the Intrepid radio program. And we broadcast normally live over at subspace.radio, but we're not broadcasting there tonight, only because we have some technical difficulties still with the sound system and hooking things through. Something is altered from what we've been doing all year long. And now we've got to fix it, and we haven't figured out quite how to fix it yet, despite having several techs on the case with this. Something is not routing properly, so we cannot broadcast and pick up the show over there at the same time. So we're sorry about that, guys. And so you just got to join us here on the YouTube channel or over on the Facebook channel. Page, I guess it is, not channel over there. And so you can tune this show in at my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Scotty Roberts. And while you're there, subscribe to the channel if you are not subscribed, and hit the little bell, and the little bell will give you notifications of this show. And you can hit the little join button. You know what that join button does? It gives you 3 ways you can become a member of this channel. A paying member, yes, but everywhere from $1 to $5 to $15 on a monthly basis. And so I want to thank you ahead of time for checking that out, becoming a member of this channel. You know what that does when you become a member? It helps me support this channel, and I appreciate it. I appreciate everybody out there who does that for me and with me. And so welcome to the program. So far, we got Steve Clark and Field Guy over in the chat room tonight. Seems pretty quiet tonight for some reason. There's more people watching, but there's only 2 in the chat room. So as people come in, I'll try to say hi if I see you. Otherwise, we're just going to roll on ahead. I appreciate the fact that you are here. And thanks for coming in. And so tonight, we're going to continue our little series on Pontius Pilate. Now, maybe that's a topic that not everybody is into that topic. Maybe people don't like the Bible study aspect of it. But I would certainly hope that you don't interpret my little forays into biblical topics as being Sunday school fare or Bible study topic in that kind of cloudy sense that we review those, because it's not. It's nothing like that today. It's nothing like that with what I present here. We're looking at other sides, more studied, researched sides of why do we believe the things we believe? You know, that question that we've asked so many times on this show. You say you believe something, and I would challenge you and say, why do you believe what you believe? Do you know what you really believe? Do you know why you believe it? You may examine all these things and come out on the other end and say, I've ended up in the same place I've always been. And this is what I believe, and this is where I'll stand, and this is what I adhere to in my life. You may look at things and come out on the other end and go, you know, things are a little different than I thought they were. And so when you find out that there are historical data, teachings, that maybe aren't ensconced in a church or a Sunday school setting about these old things, you start to question because you say, look, not everything's perfect here. And of course, if it's supposed to be the written word of God, and this is the inspired word of God that we find in the Bible, why is it that it seems to be at times so full of so many holes, so many gaps? And I'm not talking big glaring negative things that, oh, look at this. Here it actually says God was a Martian. And why did we miss that all these years? I'm not talking about something silly like that. It's usually interpreting the way texts are written, the context in which they were written, the times in which they were written, and then finding out that there are certain things about characters of people, characters of God, perhaps, attributes of God that seem to contradict messages in the Bible. I had somebody ask me the other day, why is it that you had the God of wrath in the Old Testament that would drop you at the drop of a dime? If you blasphemed or whatever, and this God who sent his angels to destroy people and cities, and God who was a wrathful God going to destroy all of peoples and things like that, and so you've got all of that that's going on, and yet then you get into the New Testament times, and what do you have? You've got in the New Testament times, you've got the God of love, the God who views you through his Son, the God of grace, the God of forgiveness, and so on. And it's so different from that earlier version of God that Judaism had. And of course, what is Christianity but a sect of Judaism that accepts that the Messiah has come? And so you ask those questions. And somebody said, why was God murderous over here, but yet teaches love and grace over here? The easiest answer was the one that I was taught in seminary, that there were different dispensations, different covenants down through the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how we used to call it stair-step dispensationalism, that God would present himself in a certain way. Let's say at creation in the time of Adam, God presented himself this way, and this is the kind of God he was. But then next, you've got the post-Edenic covenant. Ousting goes up a step, a little further away from the original, but a little further up and closer to God. Then you've got the Abrahamic covenant and the thus and so covenant, thus so Davidic covenant, all the way up to finally what's supposed to be the covenant of the age of grace, the covenant in his Son, which is the final covenant, we're told, the final revelation of God. And that's supposed to bring you to a place where you are so far up from the original covenant, the original dispensation, so far away and so far up that God might appear to be different when he's not. He's decided to operate differently with his creation. Now, that's the explanation when we were given. Or is the explanation one that God was perhaps a created God, a God created by mankind, to fit what man wanted, to fit what we needed out of a God in order to control the masses or things like that. A king using a God to control the people, to get the people to do what he wanted. So we have to look at all that, the anthropological side, the archaeological side, the historical side. All of that matters when you are trying to figure out who and what God is. And so this is what I like to do in the teachings. When I come to biblical teachings, there are certain things that I believe and I have a bias on, and that's just fine. And if you don't like my bias, it's okay. You don't have to. But at the same time, there are things that I teach and I say, look, I haven't thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And I still have certain fundamental beliefs, but they are tempered by learning things, looking at things, trying to figure out the context of things, the linguistics of things, all of this stuff. So pardon me while I take a sip. Yahoo, as the old ad used to say, back when I was a kid. So welcome to the program, Roger Rabbit. Good to see you. Sarah Yosef, good to see you. She says people can be narrow-minded in thinking that God can only feel one thing at a time. People can feel multiple things at once. That's the truth. I was just talking with somebody about this, and I don't think I talked about it on this show, although I may have mentioned it before on this show. But very recently, I was talking to somebody about how a human being changed the mind of God. And that would have been Moses. You had this scene where God's really pissed off at Israel during the Exodus and the sojourn. And he says to Moses, I'm going to wipe out these people and I'm going to reestablish the covenant or the dispensation in you and your seed. When the original promise was to Abraham to multiply his seed more vast than the number of this. And remember when he had Abraham standing out at night and he said, count the stars. God said to him, he says, that's how many descendants you will have. They'll be uncountable. And now he's saying to Moses, I'm going to wipe these people out for their sin. And what does Moses say? He says, God, you can't do that. He said, you cannot wipe out these people. You would be breaking your covenant with man. You would be breaking your word, making you a liar. And it says, and God, and here's the important phrase, and God repented of the evil he was going to befall on Israel. So because of a man, Moses, God changed his mind, repented of the evil he was going to do. And this is the same God we're told of that is not the author of evil. Hold on, I got something in my shirt. I hope it's not like a bug or something. No, it's a tag. It's a weird tag, and it's scratching at the back of my neck. But yeah, it's definitely a tag. Can't pull it out. Oh, well. There you go. So it's something I obviously left in there. You know, those little plastic string things they poke into the tags. They're not string with the little T on the end to click them in to hold the price tag in. I got one of those. I went through the wash and everything. It's a shirt that I bought, and it's got one of those on it, and it's now poking me in the back of the neck. But we'll live with it. So this is what I like to do when I present biblical topics, such as tonight. And tonight we're kind of wrapping up the whole thing on Pontius Pilate. And I think he's an interesting character. And last week, or last time we looked on Monday night, we looked at certain things about the character of him, about the history of Pilate. And you could say, you know, you want to say, poor Pilate. If a man was ever caught unwittingly in the net of historical circumstance, it was Pilate. He was a simple Roman governor just doing his job. He could see that Jesus wasn't the villain. The Jewish crowd thought him to be. And in the end, he washed his hands of the affair, tormented, it seems, by the injustice of the whole affair. But he didn't come out of it too badly. Constantine liked him and took him as a forerunner of his own imperial embrace of Christianity in the 4th century. And in the Coptic and the Ethiopic churches, Pilate soon came to be celebrated as a saint, which we talked about last time. And perhaps more importantly for our time, Hollywood has done Pilate no harm. Cinema doesn't get any better than a dramatic hand-washing scene with the Jewish crowd in the background chanting wildly, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And it all comes right out of the Gospels, of course. So it must have happened just that way, right? For filmmakers such as Mel Gibson in his The Passion of the Christ, gospel truth is just as good as historical truth. And you have to watch his movie. You could call it Mel Gibson's passion play, The Passion of Christ, and see his take. But is gospel truth and historical truth, are they the same thing? Like I've mentioned, there are things in the Bible that you have to question, that you have to put to the test, that you have to see the context. And if you find that there is something that is different from what you were told, do you then question, well, is there efficacy to this whole idea that there is inerrant scripture that was God-breathed to mankind, inspired by God? Did God say, they're going to make some mistakes, but this is my word, so basically go with it? So, yes, I did, Sarah. I watched that little documentary, and as I was watching it, I realized I'd watched it before. And so I have seen that before. And yeah, it's pretty good. And so here's the question. Most scholars don't think that gospel truth matches historical truth and vice versa. The Pilate that we know from history doesn't fit very well with this flattering gospel depiction of Pilate, the lover of truth and justice, the man aching to set Jesus free, and then the man who had to wash his hands of it. The details associated with Pilate in our gospel texts have so much more to do with the agenda of evangelists who wrote those texts than they do with the actual historical accounts. So, what does history really tell us of Pilate? Is the question we have to ask. And to be honest, not all that much. We don't know anything of his career before he became the prefect of Judea. And some of this is a little bit of recap from the other night. And the accounts from a little different perspective. The accounts of his life after Judea in Eusebius or the Acts of Pilate, for example. Eusebius, by the way, was the church dude appointed by Constantine to set down the writings of the church and to be really in governance of the church. Not a pope or anything like that, but a kind of an overseer and a recorder of acts. And but those writings of Eusebius, the writings of the Acts of Pilate, that book, are filled with legend, but perhaps we know enough. You think we know enough about it? I always think there's always a little bit more that we can know. I was contacted by a good friend of mine earlier tonight about, he's a television producer, and they want to put together a show on the secrets of the founding fathers of America. He says, "What do you got?" And we got to talking at the stories we have of our founding fathers, even 250 years old, aren't always accurate. And there's still stuff that's hidden and still stuff that gets uncovered. And that's more recent in history. Hey, Professor Bauer, welcome to the chat room. He says, watch Caesar's Messiah for details left out of the mangled biblical narrative. Yeah, I'll have to do that. Caesar's Messiah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing too. The Apostle Paul was the Apostle Paul. And you hear this in other circles and other radio hosts and so on. But the big question of Apostle Paul hijacking Christianity. There were 4 different kinds of Christianity, mainstream kinds of Christianity, just a couple of years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Well, if you believe in the resurrection, there was Peter, the big fisherman, the apostle of Jesus, who had the Jewish Christianity. You had Paul, who had the Herodian Christianity. Think of King Herod and so on, or Caesar's apostle. You had a couple of different other ones that were represented by other church leaders that we know back then, early church leaders, so early it was just fresh like last week kind of leaders. And you had all of these that were kind of vying for the right direction to take Christianity. And the ones who won, of course, were eventually a couple of centuries in the building and the making, was the literalist Orthodox Christian Church, which became known as the Roman Catholic Church. And they even put to death those who disagreed with them. In the love of Jesus, I put you to death by the sword because you're teaching heresy. So you have all of that out there. But our oldest information about Pilate comes from the Jewish philosopher and diplomat Philo of Alexandria, who in the mid-1st century, you're talking 50 to 60, so maybe 20 years after the death of Jesus, included his indictment of the Roman Emperor Gaius Caligula. A story about Pilate's rule over Judea was included in that account. And according to Philo, Pilate had arranged for 2 gold-plated shields bearing the inscriptions offensive to Jewish religious leaders' sensibilities to be set up in Herod's palace. And the Jews asked that the shields be removed. threatening that if they weren't, a delegation would be sent to Rome to complain to Tiberius Caesar. Pilate shouldn't have worried about such a small thing, but he did. And it seems he wanted to keep his Roman superiors at a distance. Philo wrote it this way: Pilate feared that if they actually sent a delegation, they would also expose the rest of his conduct as governor by telling all about the briberies, the insults, the robberies, the outrages, and the senseless inquiries, the repeated executions without trial, the constant and extraordinarily severe cruelty. And that's part of the writings of Philo, who was a contemporary of the times. And so in the end, they did send a delegation, and Tiberius Caesar did reprimand Pilate for his extreme ineptitude. But Pilate somehow survived and retained his prefecture. Now, isn't that kind of worrisome? If you screw up in your prefecture, you don't just get fired, you might lose your life. But Pilate lucked out in both accounts. I think it's probably lucky he was so far away from Rome. But the Jewish historian Josephus, writing another half a century later, recounts a similar story, perhaps a variant of the same story, involving the placement of imperial images in the Jerusalem temple. And the protest thus aroused was so dramatic in Josephus's telling, with thousands of Jews lying prostrate on the ground, baring their necks for slaughter. We talked about that the other night, rather than dispersing as Pilate had ordered. And in this instance, Pilate relented rather than cause another ugly scene. So what did Elderberry say? Oh, Jesus named his apostles those names as he found them. Marcus, Lucas, Johannan, Mattathias, and so on. Professor Bauer says, you mean these guys? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Yeah, were those their names? Those are fairly Hellenized names or Grecian names, the way they're pronounced there. But yeah, you had John, you had Matthew, you had those names in Jewish culture. Now, on still another occasion, it's also recounted by Josephus, Pilate's crowd control is probably more characteristic of his temperament and his style. If Josephus and Philo are to be believed, this time Pilate had taken funds from the sacred treasury, monies set aside for the purchase of sacrificial animals, most likely, to pay for the construction of an aqueduct into the city of Jerusalem. And when a protest broke out, Pilate sent in troops to club down the protesters, and many were killed. But Pilate, they think, also cut a deal with the Sanhedrin, saying, let me use temple funds, which the people are going to go apeshit over, and I'll make sure this aqueduct runs right into the temple compound. And you could just hear the glittering music in the background behind the Sanhedrin going, yes, we like that. So that's probably what happened. There's a variation, or probably the truth in the middle of all those stories. But all in all, the picture we get of Pilate is that of a ruthless, kind of mean-spirited conspirator, somebody out for number one, for his political coattails to be built, and probably to advance himself, and which was probably not all that uncommon for small-time Roman prefects. They aren't Aramaic, which Christ supposedly spoke, or even Essene. Yeah, they're very Grecian names, or anglicized eventually, but Hellenized names, versions of those names. Peter, Petros, that's very Greek. Now, of course, Greek was the language of the day, the language of commerce of the day. Even though they spoke Aramaic, there was Latin being spoken by the Romans. You probably had Hebrew still being spoken by the Jews. But the language of commerce was Greek, Hellenization. The whole world was Greek when it came to commerce at that time, the civilized nations. So the whole point of becoming a provincial governor, after all, was to take advantage of the position to enrich oneself. Pilate managed to do this in Judea longer than anyone else, about 10 years. and the length of his tenure is sometimes taken as a sign that he had cultivated some pretty relatively amicable relations with his Jewish subjects, because they didn't run him out on a log or get him recalled. But none of the stories we have about his reign bear this out. Rather, it's kind of more likely that he had a stronger stomach than most for the kind of ruthless violence and intimidation necessary for maintaining law and order under the Roman imperial system of extracting wealth and tribute from its provinces. And thus, when Luke mentions in passing that the Galileans whose blood that Pilate mingled with their sacrifices in Luke 13:1, it's just another example of the sort of random violence that can happen to a person. And the same as a tower tumbling over on you on an otherwise normal afternoon. That's Luke 13:4. I always thought that was a very interesting verse. When you look at that verse, it says, it's just in the middle of a statement. Jesus says, or those 18 who were killed when the tower in Siloam fell on them. Do you think they were worse offenders than all the others who live in Jerusalem? And Jesus was making a totally different point. But he was using that as an example. Like the time the tower fell and killed people at the pool of Siloam. And that's all you go, whoa, what was that? I want to hear more about that. It didn't tell you any more about that. The same thing, Pilate mingled blood with their sacrifices. Luke 13:1. Now there were some present on that occasion, Jesus said, who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. And it goes on into whatever the guy was talking about. He's just making an aside. It's like saying, that time Joe Biden tripped up the stairs. Remember that? Well, that's like, and he was just using an example. If you had no idea what the context was, you would know nothing else about the story. So when Pilate was finally removed from office, he was removed from office. It was for using excessive force to put down another minor religiously inspired uprising, and this one among the Samaritans. And according to Josephus, who was a self-styled messianic leader, had planned to lead a group of followers, we mentioned this the other night, up to Mount Gerizim, where he promised they would discover the sacred vessels, which, according to Samaritan lore, Moses had buried there. And the whole thing, which apparently unfolded close to Passover, seemed really threatening to Pilate. So he ambushed them, slaughtering some on the spot and taking others prisoner, only to execute them later. Now, this was apparently just too much. It was the last straw. And for the Roman legate of Syria, Vitellius, who by virtue of his consular rank could depose Pilate. And he did just that. And he sent Pilate off to Rome. That is the last we hear in history of Pilate. He probably lived out his life in a state of senatorial privilege, enjoying the spoils from his days in Judea. Probably. We don't know for sure. But of course, the story we know best about Pilate and all his acts that we do know about is he's best known for his role in the crucifixion of Jesus. And in a passage fraught with technical difficulties, Josephus mentions this small event in Pilate's career. At least this much of what Josephus says is reliable. He said this: when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by those of highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had first come to love him did not give up. That's a passage out of Josephus that tells you a little bit about the way he was looked at. And Josephus, of course, meaning us, and he was a Jew. And so the statement is probably about as accurate as any that Josephus made. Many high-ranking Jews worked closely with the Roman governor to ensure an effective imperial presence. And empires cannot work without collaborators. And so the Jerusalem high priest, for example, Caiaphas, was always appointed by the Roman governor. And both he and Pilate would have regarded Jesus as seditious, as our Gospels record. And so would have wished him gone. As governor, Pilate alone could authorize an execution. The high priest could not. Herod Antipas could not. The Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, could not. And so Jesus was put to death on his orders, Pilate's orders, by crucifixion. Rome's signature form of punishment for rebellious peasants and upstarts. I saw a couple of people writing things here. Professor Bowers says, let's see. What did he say? Like geezer geek for us old tech dudes. Yeah, there it is. So old language dudes. You went to seminary, professor. You were in ministry. You know, you had to learn those languages. Elderberry says, over in Turkey, the ancient world is everywhere. Gives an awesome feeling knowing people stood where you did thousands of years before. It's an awesome place. Yeah, that's what I feel when I would go to Egypt. I want to go to Israel for that reason, Elderberry. When I was in Egypt, I stood in place and I said, this person stood here and did things here. I said, even if we don't know, John and I were writing our book at the time on Moses. And I said, even if neither of us are right, I said, Moses, having been a prince of Egypt or in a position of authority, a nobleman, would have crossed his feet on this lintel to this temple into this holy of holies in Medidat Habu down in Luxor. You say, you look at that, and that not lintel, I'm sorry, the top, the threshold, and it's all concave from the thousands of years of people stepping on it. And you look at that and you say, surely this man would have stepped on this threshold, his very feet on that threshold, unless he was, step on a crack, break your mother's back kind of guy, had OCD or something. Nah, he would have touched feet there. And so Elderberry, yeah, that's what I see. It's when you see things that happen in certain places and you stand there and you say, I'm standing here, I'm looking at this monument. And you could take Moses, you could take anybody else. But I could say, Moses would have stood and looked at this chapel or looked at this temple or looked at this pyramid and walked here and set foot here. Hey, Valerie, good to see you in the chat room tonight. Nice to have you. And everybody else is coming in. Michelle Canham Free and Sean Stroik. Good to see you, brother. And everybody else who's slipped in between the cracks. Chuck Thurston. I don't know if I said hi to you or just read something you said. So, yeah, Pilate may have been on the wrong end of a Roman short sword. It's very possible. Some of the legends say he committed suicide, which may have been official suicide. You can fall on your sword or we'll come in a half an hour and strangle you and your family to death. Who knows what happened there. It's likely he may have just lived out the rest of his career, like it said earlier, in senatorial comfort and privilege. So the Christian Gospels say a good deal more about this whole thing, about the crucifixion and the execution and the deals made between Pilate and the Sanhedrin. Little of it is historically defensible. Jesus' death was for his followers an event of tremendous moment and meaning, and they recalled it making use of the cultural resources at their disposal for understanding the death of a righteous man. If Mark, the earliest gospel account of Jesus' passion, had a source, it was already a highly stylized narrative presenting Jesus as the quintessential Jewish martyr. This is that proto-gospel I mentioned the other night, if you remember that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all obviously had similar source points. Was that similar source point God, or was that similar source point? They think Luke, John, and Matthew were all based on the book of Mark, which was based on this old stylized narrative that presented Jesus as the quintessential Jewish martyr. And the story of the betrayal, the death, and the vindication of God's righteous one was a story that was very well known in Jewish culture. a story of a Messiah. And whoever created the first narrative of Jesus' passion made use of this popular genre to create the scenes and to fill them with detail. And this is how we've come to have scenes like Jesus' midnight struggle in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14:32 through 42, and the parallel passages that go with them, where all the witnesses to the most important parts were fast asleep. So who wrote it down? Who knew? Who witnessed what Jesus said there? Unless Jesus, as he's being hauled off, said, now, by the way, I'm being hauled off to prison right now, but remember, you guys fell asleep. I prayed. I sweat great drops of blood. I was in anguish. I said, let this cup pass from me, and so on. Nobody was there for that because according to the gospel account, everyone was fast asleep. And Jesus had to go wake them, saying, can't you even stay awake with me for an hour? And so you had those scenes. These all came out of, I believe, these earlier proto-gospels about the martyrdom of the whole Jewish messianic martyrdom. And so all the witnesses were asleep. Or consider the trial scene with Pilate in Mark 15, 1 through 5. Who's present to recall the details? Only certain anonymous chief priests. And who might we imagine recording Pilate's private thoughts? It says in Mark 15:10, Pilate perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had betrayed him. Those are his private thoughts. Did he say, write this down now, here's my thoughts on this? We don't know. So these thoughts of the omniscient narrator give voice to the faith of early Christian followers. They're not history. It's like when I did the series on the life of David the King, called David, the real life story of an invented hero. There was so much apologetic written in there. So many things that nobody would have been privy to. And if they were, they told the story. Maybe they told the stories later. But how do you get inside someone's head when he doesn't want you to know what he's thinking? So when we pay close attention to the details of Pilate's supposed thoughts, we can often reconnect them to the lives of those early believers. Take, for example, that the thought of Pilate in Mark 15:10, his perception of things. Of course, Pilate could have thought that the chief priests were acting out of envy, but that's not the point. The omniscience needed to extract it from Pilate's mind shows that it doesn't come from a real historical report. Now, maybe this is where you can plug in, that's where my faith comes in. God inspired Mark to write that in the Bible. That was put into Mark's head by God, and Mark wrote it down. Oh, this is a little tidbit. I kind of like this. Yeah, he perceived them being this. Well, maybe he was writing out of spiritual leading that he wasn't even aware of. So where does it come from? Why in the story of Jesus' death does Mark wish the reader to hear Pilate's private thoughts? Why should he wish us to think that the chief priests were the real culprits here and not Pilate? Mark was written near the end of the Jewish war against Rome. And when the city of Jerusalem had been or would soon be sacked, that was in 70 AD, 72 AD, I believe. When the city of Jerusalem had been or would be sacked, thousands slaughtered, thousands more sold off into slavery. Josephus's first-hand accounts of the Roman siege of Jerusalem are as grisly as military history gets. Mark, it turns out, had an opinion about these events. If we back up in this gospel to the near beginning of the Passion narrative, we find a parable, and it's the parable of the evil tenants in Mark 12, 1 through 11, in which a man rents his vineyard to tenants who beat and or kill his agents. and then his son when he comes to collect the rent. And scholars agree that Mark has added references to Isaiah at the beginning of the parable. Look at Mark 12:1 and Isaiah 5 to cross-reference those, to suggest that this vineyard, like Isaiah's, isn't just any old vineyard, but it's God's vineyard. And in this reading, Jerusalem. And he's also added the words in Mark 12:6 that speak of the owner's son as beloved, which in Markian parlance makes him a stand-in for Jesus. So in the story, the tenants in God's vineyard, Jerusalem, resolve to murder God's son, Jesus, and so they do. And what will God do in response to this outrage? He'll come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. And this is Mark's take on the siege of Jerusalem. It's a parable he wrote in his gospel. And it was to Jerusalem that Jesus had come in his final days. And it was there that he died. And for this, Mark does not blame Rome's agent, Pontius Pilate. And with Jerusalem on the brink of collapse, he could only see Rome as God's agent, the finger of God's wrath, as the Old Testament said of the Philistines attacking Jerusalem. They are the finger of my wrath, says God. And so punishing the city and its leaders for the rejection of Jesus 35 years earlier. And that's why in Mark, Pilate is reticent, while the chief priests in the Jerusalem crowd press on, demanding Jesus' death. And so in other later accounts of Jesus' trial before Pilate, more details are added. Among them, some of the most cinematically compelling scenes that one would likely see in most Jesus movies. Two of them are in the book of Matthew, 27:1 through 26. Matthew's version of the trial of Jesus. Matthew is not an independent witness to this event. It's based rather on the Gospel of Mark, which is its author used as a source. Matthew used Mark as a source for his story of Jesus' trial. Matthew's hand can often easily be seen simply by laying Matthew's text alongside that of Mark. And you can look at them as sidebars to one another. When one lays Matthew 27 next to Mark 15, one can see that the two trials are substantially the same exact writing. But two details stand out. The first occurs in verse 19. Matthew, here Pilate's wife appears in the narrative, and she sends word to Pilate right in the middle of the trial saying, "Don't have anything to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much over him today in a dream." And in Matthew, Jesus is above all righteous, and Pilate's wife is among the first to recognize it. The second is in verses 24 to 25 of that same chapter. Here, Matthew inserts into the Markan story a scene that no one has ever seen a passion play or attended Good Friday services can ever forget. It says, "So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.' And all the people answered, 'His blood be upon us and upon our children.'" These words aren't recording history, unless it's God stepping in and inspiring the writer to write something that actually happened that no one else recorded. They're clearly an editorial addition to Mark's earlier story. So the account is the same except for those two scenes which are added in. Matthew's account is identical to Mark's except for those two stories. So why does Matthew insert them? Why does Matthew strain so hard with this episode and the prior episode with Pilate's wife to exonerate Pilate? Is it not so much for the love of Pilate that he adds these details, but for hatred of the Jews? One should say, fellow Jews? For the author of Matthew was himself Jewish. But he lived and wrote at a time when the Jews and the Christians, most of them still Jewish, like Matthew, were parting company. The schism in the early church was not amicable. There was plenty of cursing and recrimination on both sides. Here you go. You're fresh out of Jesus being put in the grave and, yes, according to the story, resurrecting and commissioning his followers to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And the next thing they do is they go home and they start fighting with each other over whether the Gentiles should be included or if it was just for the Jews, and amongst many other things. The Great Schism. This was the Great Schism between Paul, the Apostle Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, and Peter, who was the leader of the Christian church back then, and tacitly the first pope of the Roman church, as they would call him. But he lived and wrote at a time when the Jews and the Christians were parting company. In Matthew, the heat of the conflict blazes bright in places like chapter 23, where Jesus, a la Matthew, spews out one vile curse after another upon the scribes and the Pharisees. Oh, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, he calls them. In one of those verses, he says, "Scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, you are like whitewashed tombs. You're beautiful on the outside, but on the inside, you're full of dead men's bones." And Jesus is decrying the Jewish Sanhedrin. And he's claiming that they're to be punished for the deaths of Christian prophets, sages, and scribes who've been sent to them. Now, Matthew holds responsible everyone who rejects him and his, not only for the deaths of his fellow missionaries, but for the death of Jesus himself. And in Matthew 27, it's not just the chief priests who prevail upon Pilate, it's all of the people, all the Jews, the crowd in Jerusalem, who announces, though rehearsing for the passion play itself, "His blood be upon us and on our children," he says. Or the people say. This is what Matthew wrote. Luke and John have their own reasonings in their Gospels for adding to the anti-Jewish cast of the trial scene. John was in a situation not unlike Matthew's, an unwilling exile from his synagogue life. He portrays his fellow Jews as abandoning Jesus while selling out to the Roman Empire. And even while Pilate resists, this is being done. And Luke, a Gentile, was anxious to demonstrate to other Gentiles that Jesus was not this dangerous peasant rebel his manner of death would suggest. And so his Pilate flatly declares to the chief priests and the rulers of the people, "I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Behold, nothing deserving death has been done by this man." That's Pilate in Luke 23. But the Jews still cry out, "Away with this man," they say. And in a sense, this summarizes one major theme that's running throughout all of Luke's entire 2-volume epic. Remember, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. Luke wrote the book of Acts. So through this whole 2-volume epic, the Jews rejected Jesus while we Gentiles accepted him. That's the ongoing theme in the books of Luke. And so Pilate emerges fair and just, if a little weak-kneed, but more or less a qualified good guy in each of our stories. And as noted in the earlier, what I mentioned about all these episodes with Pilate in the Gospels, later lore would do more. The 2nd century church, Father Tertullian, relates, a church historian, I've quoted him many times, relates how Pilate became a follower of Jesus and even tried to convert his emperor. Tertullian was a Gentile and a Roman of some rank and education who likely shared an intensified version of Luke's apologetic concern. And Pilate, the convert, serves this need. Did Tertullian make that shit up? Did he invent that out of thin air? If Tertullian continued the sanctification of Pilate, he also carried forward the vilification of the Jews, insisting that all of Israel is responsible for the death of Jesus. citing Matthew 27 as evidence. And in Tertullian's account of Jesus' passion, Pilate virtually disappears from the scene. The entire episode of his crucifixion is dominated by the Jews. And this is what Tertullian wrote. The Jews were so exasperated by his Jesus teaching, by which their rulers and chiefs were convicted of the truth, chiefly because so many turned aside to him, that at last they brought him before Pontius Pilate, at that time Roman governor of Syria, and by the violence of their outcries against him, extorted a sentence, giving him up to them to be crucified. That's what Tertullian wrote of Pilate about the trial of Jesus. So the Christian rehabilitation of Pilate perhaps would have been a fairly harmless thing if it had not been so linked to the growing anti-Semitism of the increasingly Gentile church, which crystallized above all else around the charge that Jews killed Jesus. This began a lot of the pogroms you see in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance era. The Jews in Europe there were a lot of pogroms against them, a lot of Shakespeare himself in his writings. I don't know that Shakespeare was anti-Semitic, but he certainly pointed out the anti-Semitism of Europeans. Remember Shylock, the money changer, the Jewish money lender, the usurer. And so emerged one of the great and soon to become tragic ironies of all history. After Constantine legitimized Christianity and his successors finally embraced it, and it became the religion of the Roman Empire, the empire that had once executed Jesus, along with many other innocent Jews, could now sanctify itself with the myth that Pilate had been innocent. It was the Jews who really crucified Jesus, and that supposed fact would be the pretext for wave after wave of new imperial violence directed against the Jewish people. And this way of thinking and the pattern of anti-Semitic violence that accompanied it persisted for centuries, culminating in the horrors of the Shoah, the Holocaust, during World War II. This way of thinking continues on even today, even if the intense anti-Semitism of the Nazi era seems an impossibility in the current world. It's not. But what seems an impossibility probably isn't. So long as Christians harbor these myths of our past, treating them as history, the risk that history will repeat itself as it has so many times before is still with us. And so the historian has to not be timid. I had a conversation with somebody today. It's knowing the history opens up the door and allows the light to shine in. I think I was talking with Kenny Ballos on Morning Coffee with KB. Don't be afeard. You go in and check him out in the mornings at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Central, 9 a.m. Eastern. And over on Kenny Ballas's Facebook page, we talked about truth and history and knowing your history. Knowing history gives us no excuse for making up shitty stories. So these old ideas, biblical although they might be, have to go. Whatever their creators might have meant by them, they've worked great evil in Western civilization, and they're not true. The Jews did not kill Jesus, and Pilate was not a saint. But I will tell you this, that I believe the Jews sought his death, and Pilate sanctioned it. And then you have to do what you will with that story. So there you go. That's what I got. We're going to go out right now in a blaze of glory with the Intrepid radio program, and we'll be right back with the Captain's Cabin. So all of you listening out there that may not, we're not on the radio station tonight. Hopefully we'll be very soon. Hopefully tomorrow we'll have that problem fixed. And but until then, anybody listening outside of this, live long and prosper. We'll see you right back here.
Join us every weeknight at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, 10 p.m. Eastern. The Intrepid radio program, a Scotty Roberts Productions broadcast.
Hey, folks, welcome back to the captain's cabin. Swab me decks and climb below deck and stay off the poop deck and haul the sail up the mizzen mast. Don't list to the starboard. So there you go. That's all the piratisms I have, other than ahoy and avast and by thunder added in there. So welcome back, all you flux capacitor fluxing people. 88 miles per hour. That's right. And if you got a good lightning storm, you got all the gigawatts you need. How many gigawatts was it? Do you know? Professor Brown said, it said, Gadzooks, we would need X number of gigawatts. That's in a lightning strike. Field guy, what'd you put up there? A pile of poo? Very nice. My eyes are so bad these days. Even my glasses are not helping. So I'm waiting for my new glasses to arrive. So I had my eyes tested, and he says, you're off a little bit, but, you're okay. So I got those cataracts starting to grow in my eyes already at age 62, believe it or not. So they said, it's not going to give you much problem yet, maybe a few years down the road. And even now, I sit at my computer and I'm like, what in the hell? My eyes just don't clear up these days. They're just fuzzy. And I can put on my glasses and it helps a little bit. But, what really helps? I've got these other pair of glasses like these. When I'm drawing or painting, I put these on. And I can lean way down about 6 to 8 inches from my artwork. And that's what I use these for. And these are just readers I bought off the shelf. Those are the best thing I have for drawing. So, but when I'm working on the computer and digital stuff on the computer, doesn't work. So welcome everybody. Valerie wears glasses and still can't see a damn thing. Yeah, is that the way it's gonna be now? Is that the way it is? You know, I've got my glasses, and the older I get, my eyes get worse and worse. And my eyes aren't that bad. I'm like, I drove all the way to Minneapolis and back today without glasses on because my glasses were driving me nuts. My eyes giving me a headache. And I can see fine. I just can't see the sharp details. If I want to read a sign, I'll throw on my glasses and go, oh, okay. But so I can see just fine. My colors are nice and bold and bright. And I just have, it's just that it's like my eyes don't clear up all the time. It's like, oh man, you got to, you feel like you have like morning goo in your eyes all day long, is what it looks like in my eyes. And I got to blink a few times and open my eyes really wide to see. So you were that way before you got these glasses. Are those glasses working for you, Val? Or are those the ones that you say work for shit? So Benjamin Button style, says Michelle Canham-Free. Am I aging backwards? That was also Merlin style, at least according to the T.H. White novels, The Once and Future King. Anybody read that book, by the way? You just made me think of that, Michelle Canham-Free. There was a magic about the Once and Future King when I read that book when I was a kid. And Camelot, the play, was based more loosely on The Once and Future King by T.H. White than any of the other writers. Chuck says, I'm 63. My eyesight's getting better as I get my diabetes more under control. Yeah, my eyes are definitely better with my diabetes under control. My diabetes is under good control. And so my eyes are pretty good in that respect. But my eye doctor said in the last 2-3 years, he says, you've had no degeneration of your eyes from diabetes. So that's good. Hey, Unleash Jeremy Hansen. Talked to him on the phone today. Night driving without glasses is tough for me. Me too. I don't like to do it. I don't like to drive at night. I don't like to drive in the rain. Not because I'm afraid of wet, but the wet on the pavement drives my eyes wonky. And so I don't like driving at night either. I prefer not to. Not that I can't. But completely off topic, but it's been bothering me. Is your mic a dynamic or a condenser? I believe it's a dynamic mic. It's a CAD, a C8, or a C or G8. Here, hold on. I'll tell you. It's a GXL 2200. I don't remember. I've answered that question before. Now everything's worn off of it. This microphone's about 10 years old by now, or 8 years old, or something like that. So it's time for an upgrade. We'll see as things move on. So blood pressure meds can screw with your eyesight. Yeah. I think sometimes it's my meds and stuff, but now they say I got cataracts started. I blink sometimes, or I move my head to the side or my eyes, and I'll catch like a white corona out here, like a flash, like somebody flashed a camera. But you see the curve of like the corona of like of an eclipsed moon or something with the sun shining. You know, just that instant, it goes flash. Oh, and I'll see it over here too. Now I'm starting to get it on this side. So they said, oh, well, that's the cataracts in your eyes. Well, that's just great. I said, that's just great. So apparently my mom had them too. She said she had hers taken care of. She's fine. So I thought, oh, if I have my cataracts out, does that mean I have to have like the Coke bottle glasses now or something? And they said, no. So, But the idea of somebody, I don't know what's involved with cataract surgery. Would it make you cringe? And maybe there's even a sphincter factor to it. You get all sphinctered up when you think of somebody cutting into your eyeball with a scalpel. Is that what they have to do for cataracts? Does not make me feel good. Rainy's got to go in, I think, tomorrow to get things shoved down her throat to do, I forget what they're called, to read some stuff in her throat and her stomach. She's not looking forward to that. I really do use the white strip on the road at night. When I was a teenager, I didn't understand them. Now I do. Yeah, I follow the white strip on the road too. They go past you. So Ken had LASIK years ago. See, I wanted to get that done. I have an astigmatism. I was told it wouldn't work very well because you have an astigmatism. Blah, 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 and physical stuff. That's it. It's like I insist, and I don't think it's any surprise. The older we get, the less we talk about cool shit, and the more we talk about what organs we've had taken out, what joints have been replaced, and what surgeries we have upcoming and procedures. It's just the way we are. It's humans. It's like, I think it's because once we get to this age, which I never thought I'd reach, not meaning I thought I'd die young, meaning it's a foreign thing to you when you're young. Oh, this growing old thing, that's way in the future. And now that it's here, I'm like, whoa, that time went by pretty fast, didn't it? I was just talking to somebody today about things from, 40 years ago, again, when I first got started in the field I'm in. When I was in seminary, I was in seminary in 1980, 81, 82, that 2-year period in there. You know how long ago that was? That was 41, 42 years ago. I was in seminary. When I say I was in the Marine Corps, I actually went into the Marine Corps after seminary. And I went to seminary, and I had 6 months or so screwing around trying to get my good job in my field. Couldn't find one. I said, you know what? I'm going to sign up for the military. Ronald Reagan's America. And so in 1983, I want to say it was 83. Now, it had to be a year after that. 84, I signed up for the Marine Corps for 6 years. And I went in, and that was now 40 years ago. That's crazy when I think about that. That's a lot of time. Chuck Thurston says, once they break the eye for one reason or other, things go downhill fast. Well, that's good to know. That's refreshing. Yeah. 50 seemed so old when I was young. 30 seemed old when I was young. I remember saying when I was in school, it was probably my seminary years because I was married, and I told my in-laws at the time, I said, you know what? I said, by the time I'm 30, I plan to retire. I'm going to have a successful publishing company. Comic book publishing company was what I was doing. And I'm going to retire by age 30. Got news for you. It didn't happen. That was 32 years ago. Long gone. Elderberry went into the Air Force in 81. So there you go. So, I went into the Marine Corps. I signed up to fly F-14 jets. I was going to pilot F-14 jets. And my eyes were good back then, so I could do that. And ended up never making, you all know that story. And so when I got out, what was going on when I got out? It was still, Reagan was in office. And I was discharged, medical discharge for the broken back. And I got out, and I took a job right away. I took a job before I even left the Marine Corps base. I made some phone calls, and I had a job lined up as an art director when I got back in a little ad agency. And that's where I started my advertising career, 1984-ish, right around there, and ended up staying in advertising for years. So there you go. I miss comic books, says Unleash Jeremy Hansen. Yeah, I do too. I was doing comic books back in the 80s. We had a little place in uptown Minneapolis called the College of Comic Book Knowledge. And there were several guys that I knew at that time. I can't call them my deep, close personal friends. I had some friends there, and we'd all kind of gather at the comic book shop and do stuff. It was kind of fun. But many of them, you'd recognize their names. One of these guys that hung out there was Gordon Purcell, and he ended up doing the Star Trek, the newer Star Trek. Next Generation hadn't come out yet. So he was doing Star Trek, only the red uniformed Star Trek movies. He was doing those comic books for, was it DC? I can't remember who did those. There was Gordon Russell. Peter Krause was doing the original Star Trek comic books. Chaz Truog, who is a friend still on my Facebook, he was doing Animal Man. I believe it was for DC. Back then. Dan Jurgens used to hang out there. Dan Jurgens, who was the guy who wrote the Death of Superman, the big famous Death of Superman comic book. And there were so many other guys I knew during that time period. Mostly I knew Paul Ewert. He was not one of the artists or writers, but he knew all these guys, and they all hung out there. So, Jeremy, yeah, I really enjoyed the comic books at the time, and I did my own comic book publishing in the 80s. And I'm actually looking for something here, and I'm wondering if I can find it and show you. Let's see where we got it. But I did a comic book called The Bloodlore Chronicles, and it was a graphic novel I put out. I self-published it. I went through all the comic book distribution market and so on, and it made a little bit of a splash at its time. And everywhere I went out in the country, I would line up autographing sessions and bring box loads of these graphic novels to these comic book shops in Denver, in the little town where Michigan State University is, or the University of Michigan, I mean. Mile High Comics. There was another one there. I can't remember the names, but I was able to do all that stuff. And here we go. Here's some of that stuff. Problem is I don't have it in the right format to be able to import it. So, there you go. So I'm looking at where I've got these things located. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I have some comic book drawings and stuff like that, the old pencils, and I've got some of the, I thought I saw down here somewhere, the old comic book. And it's probably on one of these shelves somewhere. But yeah, so I was doing comic book publishing back in the late 1980s. And that was a lot of fun. And I tried for several years to get a comic book publishing company up and running. Even when I went out to Detroit in the early 90s, old roommate of mine from college and a friend of mine from my youth days, high school days, we were working on doing all the financials and all the pro formas and all this stuff to put together a comic book company. And we got pretty close at times, but it was really tough trying to get investors to part money with doing a startup comic book company. Even though we had all our numbers in a row, we still didn't have tested market value. And other than the one graphic novel I did, which didn't make a lot of money, it was pretty small. I see it every now and then, which is kind of fun. That I published that in 1988, the Bloodlore Chronicles. Maybe just listed under Blood Lore, just like it sounds. Blood Lore, one word. And I find it every now and then in the comic book shops. I go, whoa, that's my old comic book from almost 35 years ago now. That's crazy to me that there was that long ago. Archie Comics, says Valerie. Yeah, we liked Veronica. Betty and Veronica. Hello, Betty. From the Archie Comics. Father Robert's Death from Above. Death from Above. Not quite sure what you're referring to there, elderberry, but preacher would be a perfect Pilate name. Oh, yeah, wouldn't it, though? Oh, there it is. I see what you mean. Just like, what was it, Maverick in Top Gun? I'd be preacher, death from above. The Lord God shall rain his death from above upon you. Yes, yeah, that would have been interesting, huh? If I had actually stayed in and been able to do that. I was told, and I may have told you on the show, when they found out I had the broken bone in my lower back, they called it an existing condition. And they were going to send me home, but my drill instructor kept me around for about a month when he found out I was an illustrator. And he had me paint that mural on the wall of Fox Company down at MCRD in San Diego. And he was going up a staircase. I don't know if it's still there or if it's been painted over 1 million times in 40 years. But it had a colonial Minuteman with his musket pointing up the stairwell and the big colonial flag behind him. And so I was well enough to stand there and paint on a ladder several hours a day, but I couldn't perform duty with my back with that loose broken bone in it. And I had there was I want to say he was a colonel, Colonel Ford. He was above a captain. He was a colonel. And he would come by. His office was right there. And he'd stop and he'd watch and he'd talk to me. And of course, you're a recruit, still in that recruit phase, because I never got that far. And I'd stand to attention. He goes, don't stand to attention. He said, just be casual. And he says, let's talk a little bit. And he told me, he says, you got some talent. He says, if you'd like to stay in the Marine Corps, he says, I can waiver boot camp for you and put you in as a first lieutenant as rank, and but you would be non-combat, and we'll put you into the advertising department in Washington, D.C. How tempting was that? Except I had already lined up this job back home, and they were just waiting on me to come home. And I said, well, sir, I've got to turn that down. A gracious offer. I've got to turn it down because I've got something lined up back home. And he says, well, son, if you reconsider, he says, let me know before you leave here. And of course, I never took that. But I often wonder, do you do that? Do you make decisions in life? Wendy and I talked about this yesterday on Robertson. The things that we do and the decisions we make, where we say, did I make that right decision? Did I, why is my life not now the way I thought it would be? I've often wondered, just not regret or anything like that, nothing so grandiose, but I've often wondered, what different turns would my life have taken if I had accepted that offer from the colonel and gone to work in Washington, D.C. in advertising as a lieutenant, rank of lieutenant? Would I have stayed in the Marine Corps for 20 plus years? Would I have been a Washington, D.C. kid at the time then? And because remember, when I joined the Marines, I was already 23 years old. So I was older than by 5 years than most of the kids who had joined. And so had I stayed in, would I have retired with a good pension? Would I have met and married a completely different wife? Would I have different kids? Would my life be how completely different? Do you ever wish you could look? And it's all very science fiction-y and fantasy. Do you ever wish you could look and see what would my life be like today had I turned that direction instead of this direction? Wow. That's an interesting question. You're exactly where you need to be, says Michelle Cannon-Free. Well, I know that. And I don't mean you. I don't think you meant that in any negative vein. It's all divine, you say. But at the same time, there are those things that we wonder about. Don't you ever wonder? I might be exactly where I need to be. That doesn't mean I don't wonder. What if I'd taken that other fork in the road, as Michelle Cannon-Free writes? That other fork. How different would my life have been? Would I have ended up in the Gulf War, which took place only a few years after all of that? You know, who the hell knows what my life would have been like at that point? Would I know the people I know? Would I have gone to the Renaissance Festival and learned to know and love a lot of those friends out there? Would I even be living up here anymore? Probably would have been living on the East Coast. I'd probably be talking with a bit of a Virginia accent. Of course, DC, you know, is pretty bland. But by the way, I see them in the camera. If you didn't see, these are my tattoos. I was tattooed yesterday. My young 8-year-old daughter, Ellery, got a gift from her older sisters for her birthday of tattoo markers. And those tattoo markers, they're kind of indelible. They wash off, but like after 17 showers, I think. So I've had 2 showers since I got these, but or 1 shower since I got these, 2 days. But there it is. There's my daughter's handiwork. Look at this one. Look at that elf she drew. I can't even, because it's all backwards on there, but you can see that's my 8-year-old's drawing of the elf. So she did an elf on my arm, and then she said, I'm going to put a Christmas star on here. And she did it look like satanic. I said, all you need now is a goat with horns on that. So, yeah, she did all these. She's got D plus E. That's Daddy plus Ellery. And the big heart around it. And a sun and rainbows and elves and all kinds of misshapen things, and a Christmas pentacle. So there you go. There are my manly tattoos right there, and prototypes for tattoos to come. So I still have to get my sleeve done. I want Zach to do that, my son-in-law, with the seventh sin. You can go look it up. Seventh Sin, spelled out SEVENTH. Seventh Sin Tattoo.com, I think it is. And then they're down in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he owns that shop. He's part owner of that shop. And they're a pretty cool place. I want to have them do a nice shoulder to sleeve tattoo on me. And I had chosen some things. I had used, now everybody's used to the song, the old Kansas song, because of the show Supernatural. But, carry on my wayward son, that song. And I had a big sword and the Eye of Ra and a sun and a glow and all this kind of weird stuff, which I probably changed now. I designed it 6 years ago after my surgery, and then I had in a banner, carry on my wayward son, you'll have peace when you are done. That's what it said. So, yeah. So, that'll be my real tattoo one of these days. I was going to do it 6 years ago and never did. And there it sits. I'll be old and, I don't know, maybe too old to get a tattoo. I need to get my tattoo. I still want to do that. So, Rainey's got 2 of them. So I got to catch up. Oh, I see Uncle Dave is here. Let's add him to the stream. Hey, Uncle Dave.
Howdy, howdy.
How you doing?
Listening to you talk about the offer from the Marine Corps, and I was thinking,
yeah,
when I was in school, and leaving school, the head of our department had gotten his doctorate with the guy who was the head guy at the Disney Channel, where they were just starting. It was like its first year.
Yeah.
And I'm at home, and I had just asked my first fiance to marry me. And I was at home on a holiday break, and I get this call from this guy at Disney, and he introduces himself, tells me who he is, and offers me a job himself to be his personal assistant. And I'm like, oh wow, and then I was all planned to go to LA. Mm-hmm. And I said, but my fiance just landed a full ride at Penn State, and she's gotten me a job as a tech director at Penn State and a Broadway position during our summer seasons. And I said, so I kind of don't want to be on the opposite coast.
Things we do for love.
Yeah. So
you
I
imagine all
turned
the
him
things
down. And by the end of that summer, we had broken up.
And so you're calling, well, you remember me? I'm Dave Potter.
No. Yeah, I didn't bother.
Yeah, you
I didn't
can't
bother.
do that.
And
yeah, you can't.
So here's the deal. So several years later, I'm out in Hollywood. I'm really good friends with a VP at Disney. I'm over at his house, hanging out on the couch, watching Star Trek, of all things.
Of all things.
And we're sitting there chatting, and I explained that I had turned Disney down from this thing, and he shook his head and he's like, "Oh, dude." He says, because what was coming around, we knew that they were going to start doing costume pieces like Three Musketeers and stuff like that. And I said,
there's a new Three Musketeers coming out.
That's right up my alley. I'd really like to work on those kind of projects. And he's like, well, start putting your applications in. And when the file gets thick enough, they'll call you back. And I said, what? And he goes, you turn the mouse down. So in essence, you told the mouse, you're too good to work at the mouse. So the mouse starts what they call a black file. And your applications for projects go into that black file until it's a thickness that they decide you've humbled yourself enough, and they'll give you some starting position.
Nice.
So I was like, yeah, I said, well, I didn't think I was too good for the mouse before, but fuck that.
Yeah, fuck that.
I won't do that. I said,
I'd love the job, but I'm not going to degrade myself.
Yeah. So
I actually was flown down to Disney in Florida I was applying for the job of creative director of the Big Red Boat.
Oh,
their internal travel agency for that. And the reason my name came up was because I worked with an ad agency, McCracken Brooks, that we had done a ad campaign for Disneyland or Disney World and National Car Rental. It was a kids' activity book. And I took all sorts of photographs of Disney World and incorporated them into, just like their old movies, what looked like animated characters from one of their movies. I created this boy and girl in the mouse ears, and they were gallivanting around all these different places, doing these activities in this book for Disneyland and National Car Rental. So you rent your car when you go down there, and you get the Disney National Car Rental Fun Book. And it actually won some awards for art direction. But one of the entities we worked with was the Big Red Boat. And that's how I got to know those people. And it came to my attention that I was asked for, hey, is Scotty Roberts, and now I was freelancing for this ad agency. And is he looking for a job? I'd like to talk to him about this open job. And so I applied for the Disney creative director job. They flew me down to Disney World. They put me up in one of the on-site hotels. And it was actually a motel. It was a villa, because it was just a ground floor entrance, private entrance to your villa, a veranda, and you come out and you walk out and you're on the site already. And so there I was in a suit and tie, and my big portfolio under my arm, and walking out all across, and it was like 170,000 degrees, and in July, and I'm wearing a suit and tie, walking across this site, and so I get there. It's air conditioned, of course, in the offices, and I met 13 or 14 people that day. I can't remember which number exactly, but it was at least 13 of them. And they're all suits and ties and stuff. And behind that, and he shakes my hand. Welcome on board, I'm told. Hey, we're hearing good things about you. Welcome on board. It's going to be good to have you here. And they just flew me down to do the stuff. And so I leave Disney World thinking, I got this job with the Big Red Boat as the creative director. and I'm hop, skipping, and jumping home. They're sending me information on schools and the Disney, I don't know what you call them, but the Disney neighborhoods. You can live with Disney people, and we all go to Disney schools and attend Disney churches and go to Disney hospitals and all of this. And they say it doesn't pay very much, they told me, but the benefits are coming out the ass, I was told. And this was in 1997. 1997. So we're talking 25 years ago. I was told that I would make right around $47,000 a year in 1997, but that my benefits were well worth far and beyond that. Getting into housing, owning a house, all done.
$40,000. That's like 4 cheeseburgers and a salad.
Today, yeah, I can't take my family to McDonald's for $47,000. But
I meant on the park. But
on the park, yeah. Oh, jeez. Yes, I would like I'd like a bottle of water, please. Thank you. That'll be $9.50. I'm like, what? $9.50 for a bottle of water? And mind you, it wasn't one of those big Magnum.
That's assuming your loan papers pan out.
Yeah. We've heard back. Oh, Mr. Roberts, we've heard back from the loan company. Your water's ready for you now. And so I went home thinking I got the job. And they keep sending me stuff over the next week, on housing and schools. And then another week dragged by and it was very quiet. And I thought, what's going on? And I called up my contact there and she said, oh, yeah. She said, I was just going to call you on this. She said, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. She said, but we can't offer you the position. And I said, what happened? And she said, it's nothing bad. She said, Disney honors its own people. And she said, after you were here and went through all of that, somebody internally wanted the job. And Disney will always honor their internal people. And so the internal person got the job. So I never got to work for the mouse. But so I hear that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah. That's what I think.
Yeah. Anyway, I searched the world over and thought I'd found true love. You met another and you were gone. So says Elderberry. Sean Stroik. Have to send me a reminder. Oh, that's to Valerie. Okay. I was to marry a gal, this says Chuck Thurston. He sounds like a World War II vet, doesn't he? And so my gal and I were going to get married. And back in 82. Turns out I would have been husband number 1 of, I think she's up to 5 now. So no to the past. Yeah. Well, you don't have to go back and relive that memory, Elderberry or Chuck. Go relive a different one. I'd love to go back and see where my life was.
Give you a quick peek of what I'm working on. I'm on Viking painting number 2. This is the settlement of Iceland.
Oh, very nice.
I don't know if that shows very well. Am I level with you?
Yep. I like Iceland. So, I'd like to go visit Iceland.
I would too.
That seems to be the vogue thing to do with travel nowadays. Well, let's go visit Iceland.
Well, it's on our way to England. So maybe
it certainly is. It certainly is.
Maybe we'll arrange a layover for 2 days or something just to get a little view of it.
Wouldn't that be nice? I figure, it used to be I did all my Egyptian travel. So I spent probably a sum total, you put them all together, I've spent maybe 5 months in Egypt in my married life over the last 10 years. 5 months of it have been 4 months to 5 months spent in Egypt. If you put them all together.
Yeah.
And I used to feel bad because Rainey would stay home with the kids and watch the kids. I'd go to Egypt. And so then she got to take some of her trips. She's gone to Alaska twice now. So for a month each time. So she's got 2 months in Alaska. And she's got a couple of Colorado trips with her brother and her mom and a couple of other things. So I say, well, if I've got, conservatively speaking, 4 months of travel in since we've been married, and Rainey's got, conservatively speaking, 2.5 months of travel in. She's a month and a half behind me. And so I figure, it's it's going to be okay for me maybe to make a trip one of these days. Now, the thing is, I got places I want to go that Rainey doesn't want to go or do, but she would love to go traveling with me. I'd love to take my wife on some trips. She was supposed to come to Egypt with me the last time I went. But of course, she went up and got pregnant, and by the time the trip came along, couldn't travel. She would have been in her third trimester. That was with Ellery, and she was just on edge. She was lucky she lived through that pregnancy. I don't know if you remember, she was skinny and gaunt, and they thought that was going to kill her. And so she didn't get to go. And so I went that last time. That's the last time I've been, was 2015. Somewhere in there. No, that's not right either. Because she was pregnant. Ellie was born in 2014. The last time I went to Egypt was 2015. So it's been almost 8 years since I've been to Egypt, which is so weird. I still have good friends from over there that write me all the time. Who asked me, Wendy asked me about Reese Shahat, who befriended her. Do you know Reese Shahat? She says, I do. He was and I think still is, John's foreman on their archaeological site. And so he still writes. He still likes posts and stuff. And I see some of you saw when I had Dr. Momin Saad on a few months back. Those are relationships. I love these men. And it's just fantastic relationships. And yet I haven't seen them now in almost 8 years. It'll be 8 years in March since I was there last. And I've turned into an old man. So I'd like to get back there one of these days. And of course, I want to do the England trip and do some filming out there with Wendy and Mark. And that I hope to do this spring. That'd be awfully nice to be able to do. So. I thought my child was yelling for me.
Yeah, I did too.
She must be yelling. Mom must be sitting over on the other side in her studio. So anyway, there you go. Not much else other than that is all I meant by looking into the past and maybe reliving things and stuff like that.
But, I did the same thing you did. So I looked at that crossroads and what has happened since then. Well, I came back and did the Renaissance Festival. So had I done that, I wouldn't have done the Renaissance Festival in the first place. That cuts out the lock-ins, all of TRMN, all of the reenactment stuff I've done, and everybody connected with that. Susan, and well, that might not have been a loss, but but it also means I wouldn't have met Amy, because Amy was, and so that would have meant that the kids would never have been in my life, and I don't know.
But you look at that too. And I think she, if you don't mind my saying, we've talked about it before on air. I think she poisoned that well enough with them that they just don't communicate with you anymore. It's almost like that is a part of your past that you can't reclaim. And
in many ways, it was a divorce, but in many ways, it feels like a death.
Yeah, I get that.
Like I feel like I can connect with people that have lost their family in a fire or something like that, that just that's what it feels like, that the whole thing
and when that well has been so seeded with bad will from the other end, it's like these are kids I'm never going to see again, and they're adults now,
and yet not a day goes by that they're not in my heart and in my mind. And
I get that,
and I think about them often. Weirdly, I visit Amy in my dreams on occasion, and those are always interesting.
Now, what year were you guys divorced?
2005.
5. So 2005. It's been 18 years.
I know.
And,
we've been divorced longer than we were married.
You need to find new girl. Go see the man on the mountain.
But I also look at that. I mean, we were together for 10 years before we even decided and before we actually got married. We were engaged and broken up and engaged and broken up on more than one occasion. And
when did you and Susie break up? Because I remember you were dating Susie, the beautiful blonde, back in, it was in Clan-Tartan days. One of our other
and I was
reenacting groups.
trying to put the exact dates, but it was in the
98,
90s.
95, 96, you started
Yep,
dating Susie.
somewhere in there. Because prior to that, I was with Tasha.
Mm-hmm. I
And
remember Tasha well.
Tasha's now a film director out she was in LA, and then she moved up north, and then she
She's
moved
on
to
my Facebook
Austin,
page
Texas.
I saw her on Facebook. We
She's
became
on
friends
mine.
on
We're
Facebook.
friends again.
That's good.
We're friends again.
And so
But,
you dated Susan. Susan was she was good looking, but she was crazy. And
crazy. Can't do anything about that. It is what it is.
And yeah, can't do much about that. And she's married now, I think.
I think the last couple married and divorced, I think, but I'm not 100% sure.
Divorced already? Yeah.
Well,
she dated my roommate Mick.
Yep.
For a few years.
So after she dated me, do you remember Jason from the Dewdrop Jugglers? Now
Yes.
a Danger Company. Jason comes up to me and he says, and it's about a year, maybe 2 years after I broke up with.
Did he date her?
Yeah, he came up to me and he says, okay. I want to ask Susan out, but if it's going to be a weird thing between you and I won't. I said, oh, no, I'm long over Susan.
Oh, bless you.
And I warned him. I said, I
protection on you.
Yes, I gave him all that warning. I came into sight one day and early in the morning, and I was basing out of the Pirates at the time were basing out of the bakery.
Yeah.
Because I was cooking at the bakery in the afternoon.
Right.
And so I come into the dressing room and Jason's sitting there and he's got this look on his face, and I just stopped and I went,
shell shock kind of look.
Yeah. And I said,
3,000 yard stare look.
Yep. I looked at him and I said, I've seen that face in the mirror before.
Oh.
Did you break up with Susan? Yeah. Susan broke up with you. Yeah. And I said, yeah, there's no rhyme or reason to it. Do you want a drink? Yeah. I said, let's go have a drink. Well, I got shows. Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay.
You're gonna drop shit anyways.
While you're drunk. Yeah.
You're a juggler. You're gonna drop shit anyways. Who cares? You come with me. And then they got back together. And they dated again. And I looked at him and I'm like, what? WTF, man? And he goes, I know I shouldn't, but I couldn't say no. And I said,
all of us, men, women listening, everybody, we've all been through that. The breakup, we're back together now. Cool.
I'm the only one.
We broke up again. Oh, we're back together now. And
Susan and I almost, we talked about it. And I said, nope. And I walked away. Jason did it twice. Mick did it twice. Her boyfriend after Mick did it twice.
Mick, by the way, there's a little story. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you remember that townhome I had, the side by side next door to the big house that I was buying, that I moved into? But the townhome, it was the one with the French doors going into my office and all that, and we had all the
space in the basement and the whole bit.
Mick rented one of the rooms downstairs and the bathroom, and had share the kitchen and stuff.
He rented the room that I crashed in right after the divorce.
Yes. And he had a little ship's bell about this size, brass bell that hung on a plaque on the wall, and he put it on the wall outside his door. So every now and then I'd walk by just for shits and go clang, 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 clang. And so he was in that room, and one night I'm up in the kitchen and I
You
hear
and I
our-
together. We were together in the kitchen
Were you there
talking.
for that?
Susan, yes, because Susan came in
But-
and she always would just walk in, and if I was there, she'd just kind of stick her nose in the air and say
Yep.
hi and walk
Well,
past.
yeah,
right?
because it's Dave. Well,
Yeah.
we're standing there then, and that was when we heard the big yelling. We heard yelling downstairs. We heard the big
Screaming and
crunch,
shouting.
clang,
It-
like that.
there was a large thud and then the clang.
Yeah,
She
there was like
pulled-
a rip.
She ripped the bell off the wall. It was hanging
Ripped
on the wall.
Bell out of the sheetrock and clocked him with the bell
Over
on
the head. She
And
could
then
have killed
she
him.
stormed up the stairs. We didn't know what it was. We just heard the clang, and you hear thud. And we're like, what the? And we're leaning on the rail in the kitchen, looking downstairs, going, "What's going on down there?" And I think
She
we had
stormed up the stairs and out the door.
stormed up the stairs and out the door. Didn't say anything. We go, "Bye, Suze." And then we kind of like
Scotty
should we go
leans
check
down
on
the
Mick?
stairwell and goes, Mick,
Mick,
buddy,
you
are
alive
you
down there?
okay?
And so yeah, Michelle Canterbury. It was a bell. It looked just like that.
A brass ship's bell.
And so he's got this big knob on his head. He goes, "Yeah, this bitch ripped the bell off the wall and clocked me with it." I go, "You
I
kidding
think we
me?"
broke up.
I think we're broken up now. And Mick was a tough guy. Mick was a tough Irish guy.
He was a former cop, wasn't he?
Well, he was a former wise guy in you could say mob work in Minneapolis, but he was an Irish thug. And then he reformed, and he went into police work. And now, at the time he was living with me, he was no longer a cop. He was doing rent-a-cop stuff.
Yeah.
And so, but he was a tough dude, and built like a fireplace. Built like this.
And again,
And-
yeah, I've been there. You want a
Yep.
drink, buddy?
You need a drink, Mick? Yeah. So yeah, that was a fun scene. I remember about breaking up, and I don't think they ever got back together.
There's something about her though. There's a magic hook because there was a point after Suze or after Amy where I ran into her at the Dubliner or someplace like that, and we were sitting and drinking a Guinness, and she was sort of being flirty, and
dude,
and I was thinking, well, I wouldn't have to make it permanent, and then I went, whoa, what do you think?
Wait. I haven't had enough Guinness yet.
I still have a car outside. I should leave.
I'll tell you, we were at a Gaelic Storm concert at the Fine Line Cafe, downtown Minneapolis. And Gaelic Storm would come. They packed that house out. And so I'm in there. This is right after Lindsay and I had broken up. Big heartache for me. That was 2004. No, 2005. March of 2005.
Yeah, we broke
About
up the same
6
year.
months before. No, just a few months before Rainey and I started hanging out.
Yeah.
And we're down doing the Gaelic Storm concert with Jeff and Nate and Eric and everybody. And we're doing the jumping around and singing to the Irish music, and drinking Guinness and all of that. And I feel this this hand slip into my hand from behind and kind of pull me. And I look, and it's Susie. And hi, you can't hear anything because the band, and we're, right down front in front of the band, and I, hey, how you doing? I say back, and she was now if she was listening to this show, I'm sure she'd get really pissed off.
Yeah, I don't care. I doubt
this,
you
but she was like holding my hand, and it was a little flattering.
Wouldn't matter. She's already turned it off because of the things I've said.
And but she was like, and giving you those looks. It's those looks you'd get of like, I don't know what it was, but it was like, what I have flashed through my mind. These weren't the words said, but it was like, do you remember Sigourney Weaver and Bill Murray in the original Ghostbusters? And Sigourney Weaver's got the demon in her, and she's floating in the air, and she goes, says to Venkman, she goes, "I want you inside me." And he says, "Oh, I think there's one too many in there already."
You know, when you said Sigourney Weaver, my first thought went to Alien.
Oh, to Alien, yeah. Oh, yeah, the alien chest thing? Yeah. No, but that went through my head. And because
I was
she was
thinking
like,
the flamethrower and saving Newt. Bitch, let her go.
she was like, you know, do you wanna take me home tonight? And I'm like, no. I remember I wanted to be polite, but at the same time, all I had flashing through my mind was Dave and his experience with her, and Mick and his experience with her. And so I'm kind of like, no.
Do you remember
I think there's been one too many inside there already.
at the house where Mick, when she was at that house, your birthday party,
Yeah,
and we were celebrating it around the time of scotch and cookies and all that kind of stuff.
sure.
And she had come. She hadn't been on the guest list. She just showed up.
Just showed up.
And I said something. Anyway, she looked at me and she goes, "Why don't you go?" And you
I'm an
stopped the
invited
party.
guest.
You stopped the party and said, "Unlike you, Susan, Dave was actually invited. The door's over there and it's still unlocked."
Still unlocked. I'm sure I was drinking because I was not being very polite. But yeah, those are the, I even had, after my breakup with Lindsay, which is a big heartache at the time it happened.
Oh yeah.
And
those were both traumatic breakups for mine with Amy and yours with Lindsay, and they were at the same time.
But she would do the same thing. I want to say it was the same party because it was one of my birthday parties, and Lindsay and I were broken up. But all of a sudden, what happens? She shows up at my party. And I think this was the year before, because Lindsay and I, remember I talked about Suzanne on again, off again, on again, off again. Lindsay was the same way. We broke up a couple of times and we got back to, hey, we're back together. Yay. And everybody's like, hey, fantastic. What an idiot. But anyway.
And that was really hard on the twins.
It was very
the
hard.
The twins really liked her. They really bonded with her. And I felt really bad for them, but
I actually told her, now, folks, you can weigh in on this if you want. Anybody sitting out there. I remember telling Lindsay at one point, I said, look, I don't care what's gone on between you and me is done and over. And by now I was already seeing Rainey by the time this conversation happened. And I said, but you know what? I said, you've done some real wrong to my daughters, to Abby and Bryn. They loved you. They saw you as, I said, yeah, the breakup was between you and me. I said, but what you don't get is that they bonded to you and you bonded to them. You made them bond to you. You brought them in, drew them in. They were what at the time? 13?
Well, they were 12 when you lived in that house. Yeah. So between
right around that time,
between 8 and 12 is when you were dating.
Well, 2000. Well, here you go. 2005 March, we broke up. So it was basically it was
you were together for about 4 years, weren't you?
My girls were born in 92, and that was 2005. So they were 13. And with Rainey, I say we met in 2005. We did. We met in 2004, but I was dating somebody. We got together in 2005. Not long. It was Lindsay and I broke up in March. By August, festival time, Rainey and I were seeing each other. So that's the dating system. If anybody remembers and go, hey, wait a minute, didn't you say you've known, blah, blah, blah. So they didn't overlap at all, but they came pretty close.
I spent an entire day trying to figure out the timeline of all my exes because there was crossover and I was trying to make sense of it. But
what I was going to say about Lindsay, when I had that conversation with her, it was around Christmas of 2005. And I said, look, you may have broken up with me, and that's all between you and me. You don't think you owe my kids anything. I said, but you bonded with them. And I said, you at least owe them a conversation. Call them up. Talk to them. I said, if you don't, that's fine too. Goodbye. And because you're hurting my kids, I never want to talk to you again. I said, but I think you owe them a little talk, a little, hey, so, your dad and I broke up, but, whatever you want to say. I said, you just left them hanging like a friend of theirs, somebody they started to love, and you left them high and dry. I said, and she didn't think she had to do that. I said, I beg to differ. You need to have a conversation with them. You don't do that to people.
I agree.
If you do it with me, it's different because we were dating. I said, but and you're not.
But
You know,
when you
she
play with
broke
the
up with me.
affections of children, when you play with the affections of children, you can't do that.
Do you know how she broke up with me after we dated for 4 years?
She said,
She
"I
broke
break
up
with
with
thee, I
me
break with thee, I break with thee." And then
and
she
threw
threw
dog
dog
poop
poop
on my
on your
shoes. No, she broke up with me on what was the Google version of chatting, like Messenger. I went to England with the guys with our famous England trip,
Yep.
and I came home. She was home. She came home another week later because she was flying and doing stuff, and then we couldn't get together, and then she broke up with me on like Messenger, texting. You know what? I think it's over between us, and I'm like,
What?
what? So not
Nice.
that matters anymore, but all of this, I'm telling these stories. I think these are great stories only for the reason that we all go through shit like this and
We
bullshit
do.
like this.
We do.
And I think they make colorful stories for talking about in a little chat radio show like this or a podcast like this. It's kind of fun to recount these things because we all learn stuff from that. And
Very true.
Susie made the mistake once of she would come into my posts on Facebook. Your Susie, formerly your Susie. And she'd always make a snide comment about something.
Yeah.
And I
she
was
doing that
never
on mine too.
I
blocked
never
her at
had
one point.
problems with her. I never had arguments with Susie. And I'm like, why should she do that? But there was something I put up. Remember that old picture of Maria Nilsson that it has to be 8 or 9 years ago. I had a picture of her. She's in a black tank top and tight jeans. She's standing up on a rock formation and she's got her camera up and she's looking at something. And I had photoshopped in a pistol on the front of her belt and a holster and a whip hanging from her side.
A la Indiana Jones.
Yeah, a la Indiana Jones. And I had posted that picture and I said something. This is my archaeologist friend, Maria Nilsson, over in Egypt. And Susie came in and she goes, I don't remember how she introduced what she was saying, but she said, I don't know any archaeologists that look that good. She's too good looking and dressed too nice to be an archaeologist. This is a bunch of bullshit. Something to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like,
I remember the incident.
I'm like, what? And so eventually Maria came in. Now, Maria doesn't care for any of this stuff. As far as she can throw it. She's not that kind of person. But she said, Miss Susie, you could hear her saying in her Swedish accent.
Yeah.
Well, Miss Susie, I must tell you, I am indeed an archaeologist, and our site is Gebel El Silsila, and I'm a PhD with Lund University out of Sweden. She said, I'm sorry you don't think I'm authentic. She said, but I just wanted to let you know, yes, archaeologists do dress in black tank tops and blue jeans sometimes. We're not always caked in muddy shit. Because Susie says something like, I know archaeologists and they're always dirty and grimy and fat and whatever. And, I'm like, well, Maria's very different than that. And so
this isn't somebody you sleep with, Susie. This is.
Yes. And so she actually, Susie, to her credit, she did her little mea culpa. Well, I'm sorry. I had the wrong impression. I misspoke and so on. And I said, that's okay. I said, there it is. So anyway, well, we got people over there. I haven't seen a lot of comments of late. So I think people are kind of wrapping up. We're down to about 13 live watchers in the chat room.
Well, that's actually pretty good for this time of night. But
for this time of night, yeah, we usually get up to about 30 live people in the chat room, 25 to 30. And so it's good to have everybody here. It's now 11:01. And so we're going to call it quits for tonight.
So this painting I'm working on, which I've
Good night, Uncle Dave. Oh, I thought you were
I
mocking.
could ask you just say
I'm
something.
starting a new topic now that you're signing.
No,
in.
I'm not. I'm
Oh,
not starting. I'm just gonna say I started this at the beginning of your show,
oh, good.
and again, it's when I'm not doing portrait work, I can paint really fast.
Yes. when it's just shapes, and we're gonna put some happy little leaves on this tree.
Yeah.
With the
Well, I've got to put
brush.
the village in. The village is going to be time consuming
Yes.
because there's all
I'll
kinds
get
of
it.
details there. But
Well, that'll
yeah.
be fun.
You still haven't taken time to look at the portrait, and I desperately need
I
your
went and
information.
looked for it the other. I couldn't find where you sent it to me.
It's on your messenger. It's on your messenger.
I went to Messenger. Now, which David Potter account did you? I scrolled back and I couldn't find any pictures.
Well, there's only
I saw
two,
these
so
stupid, insipid videos you send me, but no,
those
I'm
are
just
all
kidding.
related to things.
I
topics
know.
that you talk about. Otherwise, I don't
I'm
send them
rubbing
to
it
you.
in. But I scrolled through a bunch of videos. I couldn't find it. And then I looked at your other Dave Potter Facebook.
Okay, I'll send it to you
find
again.
the picture, so send it to me again.
I'll send it to you again because
All right.
the event is this weekend, and I'm trying to decide: do I scrap this
That's right,
portrait or
Sarah.
do I finish it? So,
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at it.
all right.
But certainly don't go by what I say. You go by your own heart.
I want your
You don't be afeard of your own
opinion.
heart.
I want your professional opinion.
I will give you my professional opinion. You may not like it, but you may like it. It may save you a lot of grief in the long run. It may give you
Exactly that.
abundance of happiness. But
'Cause
don't be
they don't
afeard
know
of
it's
what I
coming.
have to say. Whoa, he's gone. Well, there you go. Now I don't have to get rid of him for the night. Dave, wherever you went, you just dropped. So everyone, I want to thank you for being here tonight. Thanks for being part of the show. And you know what? I'll see you on Friday. For Fridays are ghost days. So you have a good Thursday tomorrow, and we'll see you then. Live long and prosper.